Welcome everybody to the ICT track session. We are going to have an exciting panel today, exciting talk today, and also exciting demos. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today and great learning experience for all of us. Thank you all for joining. The session is being recorded. If you have any questions, please put it up on the chat. During the talk, the plan is that for first 20-25 minutes, we have the talk and then we will do the Q&A. So please hold off your questions until then, or you can type in the chat and we will just take up during Q&A session. And likewise in the panel, we will have initially the time for just the panelists, and towards the end, we will have time for Q&A with the audience as well. So that is our plan. And with that plan, I want to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dave Warner. Dr. Dave Warner is a medical neuroscientist with an MD PhD researching new methods of physiological-based human-computer interaction to identify methods and techniques that optimize information flow between humans and computers. He has extensive experience working in this space of national security, as well as in the broad disaster management domain as well. Much of his recent work has been in military civilian operations, supporting cross-domain information sharing and open communication capabilities in difficult settings such as refugee camps and disaster areas. Since 2006, Dr. Warner has been directing an ongoing operational experimentation effort in Eastern Afghanistan, focused on demonstrating that incentivized information sharing is vital to complex operations, and that creating environments conducive to information sharing benefits coalition partners, international organizations, NGOs, and the local community. So it's a very impressive invited speaker we have today. So let's welcome Dr. Warner. And Dr. Warner, to you.
Okay, great. Looks like my mic's on. Everything's working, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first thing I wanted to do is I have some things to show. Actually, I've got zillions of things to show, but I really thought what would be a novel kind of opportunity here, given that I've been with this organization before there was this organization. And this has been a wild 2 decades. So what I want to do is give you like a maybe 5-minute history of where did STARTIDES come from? And what how did all this happen in the first place? So I had graduated from medical school and had working on my PhD, and I got involved in some DARPA projects. And at the same time, I got hooked up with a group called the National Institute of Urban Search and Rescue. And this was a group of firefighters, police, other groups that were doing their best to figure out ways to get people to communicate, because every disaster, people would show up, and back in the 90s, everybody had radios, no radios could talk to each other, different groups couldn't talk to each other, and it was a cluster. Now the recording, I'll probably edit my terms. And it was really suboptimal. So a lady named Lois Clark McCoy, whose father actually worked for Wild Bill Donovan, the director of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. So this came from a very interesting stock of people. And in that group of National Institute of Urban Search and Rescue, NIUSAR, was Lynn Wells, was Eric Rasmussen, and several folks that came from the military, came from other groups. And it was kind of Lois's meeting. She worked very hard, dedicated the last part of her life to making sure that when disasters happen, the right people that show up have the best equipment, the best communications, and I'll focus in on communications, and they could talk to each other. So everything was sort of moving along. And then Eric Rasmussen, who was fleet surgeon of 3rd Fleet at the time, came up with this idea going, hey, we're going to do RIMPAC. This is in 2000, the Rim of the Pacific, where all the nations in the Pacific go blow up each other and then drink beer and congratulate themselves after an exercise. He said, we don't do Normandy anymore. We do Timor, we do Haiti, we do others. And when we show up as military, we don't know who's there. We don't know these people. We don't know how to talk to them. Why don't we hold an exercise in Hawaii? And so he came up with this project, Strong Angel, and it's on the web. You can look it up. And it was the most fantastic array of groups of people. We got the US military to provide space. We actually set up a civil military operations center on the island of Hawaii, set up a refugee camp, got volunteers, Hawaiians, to come be in a refugee camp. You can imagine the social engineering that took for that. And then over a week in really harsh conditions, and we also invited in not just simulated actors, but actually people from the UN, from the World Food Program, from UNHCR, from all of the actual players, because the idea was, if we're going to spend all of this time and effort to do an exercise, why don't we meet the people that we're seeing when we hit the ground and the disasters? And so this group from NIUSAR, National Institute of Urban Search and Rescue, rallied around and supported Eric in his Strong Angel exercise. It was actually an official military exercise during RIMPRAC 2000. And it was there's long histories of where the name comes, et cetera, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is that after this was over, and it was about a week in June in 2000, what we realized when we were doing after action reports and looking at all the communications was there's common things of every disaster. First of all, nobody that shows up from the different organizations has ever met each other. And so they're learning to interact for the first time. It's like, well, that's great. But when things are burning, smoldering in stability operations or disasters, et cetera, it can be problematic. And so as we did this exercise and did the write-up, pitched it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pitched it to just about everybody. They're like, you guys are crazy doctors and you're doing this. Why don't you go to the real world? So the DoD funded Eric and I to go to Africa and to go to refugee camps and actual sites where disasters kind of are happening, but the US military was not involved, and where we could actually understand what people did when the US military or the US NGOs were not there. And boy, that was a learning experience. So traveling around Africa, going to different refugee camps, and it really didn't matter where you went and what disaster, what refugee camp, what problem, there were some commonalities that kept coming up over and over and over. Communications, electricity, logistics, comms, lift, and power. And they always fail. Comms, lift, and power always failed. And the first people's job to get there, if they had the means to, would be to reconstruct, to sort of build that back up. And it was universal. It didn't matter if it was a refugee camp, didn't matter if it was a conflict zone, didn't matter. So we got back from Africa, gave our reports, and we, on my notes here, we're moving along, getting ready for another exercise, and then 9/11 happens. Now, 9/11 is kind of important in this because at the National Institute of Urban Search and Rescue, several of our key players were actually in the towers when they fell. And the reason they couldn't get out of the towers is the communications failed them. We heard the radio sequence, we saw it, and comms failed. And they died in the tower because they couldn't get out because they didn't know it was coming down. They actually had, during the analysis, probably about 20 minutes lost. And therefore we lost actual members of our part. We thought, well, this is not good. First of all, personal loss is really great, but some things you can't fix, but some things you can. And so we started working on what kinds of things, redoubling our effort, forget all the peripheral kinds of incentives and different projects. Let's fix the communications problem. And so starting after basically 9/11, this group, which is part of the STARTIDES, but the National Urban Search and Rescue and a couple others got together, and we started planning for and working and finding places where all the people that wear the different hats meet. And by different hats, I want to give a physical illustration. Okay, so if you're going to be in communications and disaster relief, you got to wear several hats. One of them is the fire hat, right? And then you have to realize that you're also probably going to be working with the military. That's another hat. And then if you keep doing this long enough, you'll find out that the spooks come in, and this is another hat. And then if you keep doing it long enough, the contractors come in, and they're another hat. And as of recently, now there's another hat. So I bring this up kind of as a physical illustration is disasters cross all boundaries. And the one part that is always failing is communications. And communications is, and by this, and I'm going to go into a little bit more, I mean different things. First of all, you've got to have connectivity for communications. Communications is bidirectional, not information, which is usually monodirectional, but bidirectional. And for that, you need some sort of connectivity. And so we started working on all the places, and we did several projects. We came up with this idea of can't really schedule disasters, and a lot of us actually have day jobs in other worlds. What if we could link up and shadow other projects that are going on that have these various players so we can learn how do they think, how do they talk, what terminology do they use, what kinds of things could we put together that could facilitate. A disaster is a disaster, hence the name. So it's, again, try to fix the things you can. So we've been focusing in on, and when I mean we this time, we kind of got a little bit outside the box of the National Institute of Urban Center Rescue, and you'll hear about the Synergy Strike Force. And the Synergy Strike Force is my group. It's a coalition of the willing. And basically, we don't belong to anybody. We're not part of any official organization in general. We're like, in a sense, we're kind of like neurotransmitters. We're in the gap between the cells. We're the ones that help facilitate the communication across the different groups. And so as we started working this, I came back after Africa, and the DOD's kind of given us, a fit about, well, Dr. Warner, anytime someone says Dr. Warner, I know that whatever follows is not going to be good for me because I'm usually Dr. Dave. And they're like, well, you need to practice this stuff in disasters. And I said, I was just in refugee camps. How about I found a place like that where it's dirty, where it's hot, there's no water, there's no power, it's bare sand. We got to bring up something. Why don't we use Burning Man actually as a template? You can imagine that I got a little pushback from that idea from the DOD and others, but a group of us, and including Eric Rasmussen, Pico Comments from MedWeb, and an array of others, we started showing up at Burning Man the first year of 2002, and for 18 years, our group has been going out to Burning Man, setting up communications, doing the interconnection between the different groups. Why Burning Man? Well, first of all, nobody's shooting at us very much. Second of all, what people don't realize is refugee camps in other countries, there's all kinds of legal requirements of who can talk to who, how far away you have to be. To get to Burning Man, legally, logistically, you have to go, you're in a country, the US, you're in a state of Nevada, you're in a county, you're on an Indian reservation, and you're on Bureau of Land Management land. And so it also provided a template for us to work on all the trans-boundary communications, all the different groups. And we thought, okay, we've got the time, it's not really a disaster, and Burning Man has a beginning, a middle, and an end, it's over. And so it's time critical, it's hot, it's dusty. And for 18 years, our group has gone out and tested our equipment. We break it there. We've taken all kinds of satellite communications and wireless radios and you name it. We've taken it out there, used it, worked with the people. Had to come up with a camp name. So the camp name for us is we are the pseudo-feds. Privacy invasion is performance art. And we were doing all the sort of communications infrastructure, never becoming part of Burning Man, but learning about it. Another project we did was the Super Bowl 2003. Now, this is a national security event, was the second Super Bowl after 9/11. And we thought it was in San Diego, and I live in San Diego, and I'm got good connections with the universities and other places. And we thought, man, this would be really great because we can put up a parallel ops center. And of course, there was all of the federal agencies and all of the, they came in with their structures, but we made friends with the local police force. We made friends with the university. We had an off-site integration center, and we invited everybody we knew to show up and put sensors, communications, and things around the Super Bowl without interfering with the actual security of the event. But by the time the event came along, we were so integrated, we became part of that event. And that was another learning experience. And one of the things about the Synergy Strike Force is you learn things by doing things, not talking about it, not creating PowerPoints, not doing, et cetera, et cetera. Those are good for sharing, but you really got to go somewhere and do something. And the third one in 2003 was the DARPA Grand Challenge. And he said the first one, robots, Barstow to Vegas, they only made it 7 miles. We set up a communication route all the way from Barstow to Vegas, outside of the official one, because some of our friends were actually in Iraq. And we used the DARPA Grand Challenge as a way to talk to the different military groups, to learn how that process went, and to then be able to start supplying communications, not just in disasters, but into war zones. So going a little bit further, then, I guess two wars later, Strong Angel 2 in 2004. And we got together, lessons learned, the communications had just bumped up, where first time, basically, if you didn't have a satellite phone, you were, have special permission to get on communications, you weren't really going to play. And at Strong Angel 2, we had fat pipes to the internet, we had point to point. Over the last 2 decades, the technology has just impressively gotten better for communication. I mean, first times we were at war zones and communications, really, if you weren't on a satellite phone or something like that, you had no communications. And now, and I'll get to this in a bit, in Afghanistan, 3G out in the wilderness. It's gone quite from the Stone Age to cyberspace in 15 years. It's been quite a thing. Every time we did the Super Bowl, the DARPA Grand Challenge, Burning Man, we come back, we brief it in the Pentagon. Lynn Wells would try to give us the good meetings. And it just became, and finally I was like, guys, we're fixing this problem. Why do I keep hearing you have this problem? Well, here are some solutions. And it's like, well, Dr. Warner, the D in the Department of Defense is defense. And if you're not really working in a war zone, all your lessons are not going to be taken seriously. Like, oh, crap. All right. So next thing I know, Eric and I are in Afghanistan, 2004. And then, this starting to get real. This is not an exercise. This is where real things are going on. And then shortly thereafter, that was, I guess, November in 2004, then December 2004, the big tsunami. And by mid-January, I find myself in the rubble pile in Banda Aceh. And what was so amazing was when we got to Jakarta, and DOD sent us in, and Lynn can tell you that's probably the most number of memos in the shortest period of time. It's like 200 to actually get myself and Eric Rasmussen far forward into the tsunami. And when we got there, we go into the UN meeting, and lo and behold, it's the guys that were with us in the Strong Angel projects. And I swear, I doubt this has ever happened in any other disaster where the UN people got up and go, oh, thank God the US military's here, and they came and gave us a hug. I'm pretty sure that's a very unique event for the most part with those folks. And one thing we were also able to do in communications, because now bandwidth, and we're helping bring, at that point, telecommunications without borders, kind of like Doctors Without Borders, where people were starting to bring beacon satellites. Remember, this is like 2005 at this time. And made another discovery. First of all, everything's like the same. Everybody shows up, nobody knows each other, real disaster, nobody's allowed to talk anybody's communication, blah, blah, blah. And so we solved the communication problem, and then what do you give them? Well, what did the military have? Because one thing I found about disasters is make friends as soon as you can. Well, it turned out that San Diego State had the ability to process incredible satellite imagery, and we were able to then deliver fresh satellite imagery and printouts, shareable, releasable, no caveats to all the people we were working with. And that was probably a watershed event, because it turned out that no one had ever been able to do that openly. It happens all the time in front areas, underhanded, little things where there's no policy support. So after that, and this is really, really important, Lynn Wells took it upon himself to say, you know what, we don't have a policy to support these kind of things in DoD. And through a series of meetings and other things, came up with and pushed through a policy 3000.05, DoD policy 3000.05, and you can look it up to this day. And it says stability operations will be on same play as combat operations, which basically said the military has a policy to support other than combat operations. It's more complex than this, and I'm summarizing probably really bad, but that's what it is. And then as things went on, and I'll probably cut off here to cut a couple minutes, we get the ability to work with folks, we get the policy together, everything's working, and no one's letting us far forward use their bandwidth. So I go to Afghanistan, and I'm working with the NGOs, and I'm working with the civil military groups, I'm working with the human terrain teams, and no one's allowed to share information, share communications. And I think it was STARTIDES, probably 2007 or 8, that they brought a Gator, and we were able to get it from the Pentagon delivered to Eastern Afghanistan through our network. And we ran the fastest unblocked internet in the country for 18 months. And I've set up, there's, if you want to know the backstory, Google beer for data, and you'll find us. We had to set up an op center far forward and did a bunch of crazy things. Who knew, 18 years of college, 2 doctorates, and I ended up running a bar in an Islamic country in a war zone. But turned out the Beer for Data program was probably one of the most impressive information sharing operations to get the NGOs, the military, the local nationals, other groups to actually share. So let's see, I'm pretty much, I could go on for probably about 14 years with this stuff. As I was preparing for this talk, I realized that I probably shouldn't show any slides because it's just too much. Incidentally, if anybody is interested in more information, contact me through this site. I did, and through this STARTIDES thing, and they can get to me. And I'm more than happy to share. I got hundreds of PowerPoints. I have literally tens of thousands of images. And speaking of which, I want to share a couple images right now. I got a couple minutes left here. And I'll just give you a really brief history. So hang on a second here. Am I sharing my site? Here we go.
Yes, you can.
Okay, share it is. That's not what I want. That didn't work. All right, am I still there? Hello?
We can, yes.
Okay, okay, yeah, sorry. This is the first STARTIDES in 2007. Just to give you a little sort of factual history. And comms, as you can see, and shelter, and there's solar cooking here too, are the pillars of things that started in early 2007. This is what it looked like. And I got to tell you, it's kind of fun to come into this because it was an idea in 2007. We've gone through all of these years, it's 2020, and right now, the same things, the tech has developed better, but the same core principles are involved with communications are absolutely essential for stability operations and shelter. There's the early hexyurts. And let's see if I can get this to play well with others. And the Zoom thing is taking over my, this is 5 years later. Now, actually, this is the same year, 2007, in the Pentagon. And yes, Congressman, I look forward to addressing the committee how I got these shots of the Pentagon. And then 5 years later, we were actually got fiber optic connections from the Pentagon through policy. And we were able to actually have a lot, because inside the Pentagon, you don't really have a lot of communications. It took us probably 2 years of STARTIDES to get it through. And we were actually able to get the DoD to fund and to allow us to communicate. And then finally, this is 2017. So what I showed you was 2007, 2012, 2017. The same basic structures are there. So while the technology is better and other things are moving along, there's actually very little that hasn't been affected by technology. What is now the point is to make sure that we can scale this across so it doesn't take a bunch of overeducated power nerds to sort of let this happen. And I think that's just finally, that's me on Eastern Afghanistan. The one thing about working these projects is I get sent to really great places. I get to see all kinds of things. I get to be James Bond. I get to be a Santa Surge. I get to run the Gator in Afghanistan, negotiation skills, Burning Man. And by the way, JC, I put this picture in there for you. The red tape, this is actually the first unclassified server on the networks that allowed us to do information sharing between DoD, far forward, and reach back, and also at our site in Afghanistan. And I actually had to cut through the red tape. Yeah, there's a bunch of backstories that I could, like I said, I could go on for quite a bit. You get to see poppy fields, and I'm just going to leave it with this one here. ICT, information communication technology, is essential. You can live, it's one of those things that you can't really live that long without. And that, I think, I'm going to stop sharing. Back to the big screen. I now return you to your normal programming. Again, I have tons of PowerPoints and things. If anyone's interested, I can send links. But I wanted to give a sense of, in the last 2 decades, the tech has completely transformed, but the problem remains the same.
Thank you, Dr. Border. That's the fantastic message. I think there is a lot of things to learn from, of course, your experience. I'll open the floor for quick questions if people have. You can raise hand or just put in the chat. I will actually allow you to unmute and yeah, ask the question.
Dave Silva. Let me shut this thing off.
Nick, you were asking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Pretty clear, Dave? I'm getting echo on my side. Are you getting echo on your end?
Actually, we are hearing some echo.
Yeah, it's on my side. Don't worry, because I'm in.
Maybe post the question into chat.
I was going to actually ask it. Can you hear me? Put this down. Okay, it's fine now. So can you hear me?
Yes.
So excuse me, because I actually had 2 sessions up, one on my work computer on Zoom, and then my personal computer. We were having some changes that were happening in Cubic. So the realignment Gator kind of the structure kind of changed, but our commitment to disaster relief that hasn't changed. It will never change. But Dave, I had a question in regards, you made a comment to communications failed in 911. Was it the alert communications? Which portion of communications failed?
Okay, so I can answer this very specifically, and it's a little bit of a was a little bit of a suboptimal thing. A year before 9/11, a group of us had looked at specifically the New York City emergency responder radios, and they're in the urban canyons. And while the headquarters could talk to headquarters and the big things, they had a problem. And I brought this up, and I was shut down by the director, and we'll leave people nameless. And he said, Dr. Warner, I have the 13th largest force in the world. We have all the communications we need. And he really believed that. He actually believes, he's not a bad guy. And, you know, one of the lessons learned, and I'm trying to keep my, you know, it's hard not to get cynical when you work on these things, but ignorant arrogance is not a countermeasure, right? It's just not a countermeasure. And if somebody that understands the tech and things is giving you information, maybe you might want to look deeper at it. But it was the radios failing. We could hear the one side of the radio and where they were in the building. And anyway, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but it motivated us to work harder to solve those kinds of problems. The only thing that worked consistently, because we actually had robots in the NIUSAR group, again, we're from everywhere. And we actually had robots on the rubble pile in under 24 hours because we had a network of humans. And these humans were all linked into their own respective places. And we were able to precipitate that out and put folks on the ground in the way they need and give them reach back support.
Great.
So just Lynn here, if there ever was a talk that was essence of STARTIDES, this is pretty close to it. And Dave, thanks very much. And thanks for being along on the ride for so many years here. And there's so many friends here at this session, you know, JC, Dave, Eric, Vinay, Gator. Anyway, it's really great to see the connectivity and the continuity.
And Lynn, thanks for the ride. It's been a wild ride. You know, it's like a 20 trips to Afghanistan, you know. And by the way, just for the rest of you, and I know it's on the record, at Burning Man, a year before Lynn showed up, we actually set a record, most top secret clearances dancing on an RV. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. But again, more stories.
Great. So in the interest of time, one more question we have from the chat, and then we move to the panel. I know with this extensive experience you have, we could just go on and on for the entire day. So I will just, to being moderator role, I'll just keep a count of time. And with that, there is one question on the chat that is about, more so than question, it's comment and observation as well, that the new lingo for disaster response has become smartphones and texting. But like on the other hand, it's pretty amazing what people have done with SMS. So the shift that actually what you talked about, the growth in technology, but the problem remaining same. And any thoughts on that, on the this new forms of communications?
A couple things I want to put a shout out to. OpenStreetMaps. Ushahidi, groups that had done open source tools that those of us downrange could use without worried about, you know, getting in trouble for using software we didn't own or communicating over channels that weren't there. The open source community has provided probably some of the most important benefits for the very front edge. When you have groups, you have people from different groups, and they're not allowed to have a login onto somebody's server so they can talk. There's you know, and the internet has solved a lot of this, and the tools are available. That's why you didn't hear me talk about specific tools other than the Gator, which, you know, I'm a big fan. It really is, the tools are there. It's the cognitive processes, and it's also adaptive. What was true 5 years ago is not necessarily true 2 years from now on how to deal with it. There's always going to be people. They're always going to need to communicate. And whoever fixes that problem generally wins. I've never gone anywhere and said, hey, you want some bandwidth? And, you know, they're like, oh, you're a spy. It's like, yeah, but this is free bandwidth. Like, oh, okay. You know, I've never really had anybody actually push back on giving them something that helped them do their job better and helped us to get out of their way.
All right. So with that, let's end the invited talk session for our today's ICT track. Thank you, Dr. Warner. Fantastic discussion, very experiential. And we will look forward to hear more during the panel session as well. So without any delay, I have introduced Dr. Warner already, and I would like to introduce 2 more panelists we have today. Again, with great experience, Dr. Walter A. Dorn. He's a scientist, educator, author, and researcher. He's professor of defense studies at the Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Forces College. He teaches officers of rank major to brigadier-general from Canada and about 20 other countries, and specializes in arms control, peace operations, international criminal law, international verification enforcement, and I can go on and on with that. But most importantly, peacekeeping operations of United Nations, where he has extensively served and contributed. So it's an honor to have you, Dr. Dorn, as well. I would like to also introduce our another panelist today, JC Hertz. Some of you know JC, looks like. It's a pleasure to meet JC, first time on my side. JC is the CEO of ION Channel, a software logistics and supply chain assurance platform for critical infrastructure. She's a visiting fellow at George Mason as well. George Mason's the National Security Institute, and she co-chairs the Department of Commerce and TI's working group on software builds for materials for security sensitive public and private sector enterprises. So with that, welcome JC as well, and our 2 invited other panelists as well. So thank you, panelists. And with that, let me just make some settings to see if I can make. Okay. So with that, we have basically our 3 panelists, and I want to first, with this introduction, welcome our panelists, and I would like to ask them to briefly give like a 2 to 3 line just a vision. That's very my first question is, where do you see, just the way as we heard in the invited talk in the first part of the session, that while problems remain the same, our technology have grown, and that's great. But what is your, like on your wish list, one change or one expectation from the ICT technologies that you would like to see to help address those same sets of problems, basically related to whether communications, logistics, or power management, or better relief? So with that, Dr. Dorn, would you like to start?
Sure. I have prepared a PowerPoint. Let me know if you want me to do that, or just respond very briefly to the questions.
If you would like to start with that, that's fine. Please go ahead.
So give me a time limit, because I don't want to eat into other people's time. I see it's 3:25 and we go till 3:45, so that's 20 minutes.
So you can take, if you want to take like 5 minutes for this, that's fine. You can please go ahead and.
Okay, so I'll take a presentation. I had planned for 15, but I'll reduce it. So I'll go down in speed a little bit. But I want to say that I feel like I'm really amongst people of the same mind, and not only mind, but also heart, thinking about these issues of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And my background is as an operational professor, trying to get to the field and applying technologies. I'm a scientist by training, but I've ended up working with the Canadian military, try and help improve UN peace operations. And currently I have the crazy title of technology innovation expert with the United Nations while I'm on sabbatical. So I've been exploring how UN peace operations, which are multidimensional, including a strong humanitarian dimension, can use technology. And we had an expert panel in 2014, which produced our report, Performance Peacekeeping. And one of the things we found is there was a great need for countries to contribute who have advanced technology. And by advanced, it's something that we can consider normal in Western militaries, but that the UN was lacking. And so it was really a call to action for the UN. When Germany went in to Mali, for instance, they used UAVs and armored personnel carriers with very advanced electronics, electromagnetic spectrum analyzers, and all kinds of technology that the UN would love to have for the more general nations, but it was pretty isolated to the tech CCs. So we're looking at some sort of partnerships. The UN did use some radars to look at incoming rockets, artillery, mortar in Mali. And I wrote up an article to describe how the radars saved lives. When people heard the incoming sound of incoming mortar through the alarm system, the alarm was going off, they left their places of residence and took refuge under the Hesca bastions, and were able to actually not be there when the mortar arrived. In Central African Republic, the UN did play around with some technologies, aerostats, what's called a hover mast on a long wire that brings both electricity and the imagery to and from the vehicles and to the central stations. But probably the most used was the quadcopters, the GGI Phantoms used in Central African Republic. Now, once you have that information, you got to analyze it. And the UN did a fair amount on GIS, but I'm going to skip over a lot of this. Had to realize that they needed secure networks for a lot of the information. A lot of it doesn't need to be secure, but some of it does, particularly when you're working with allied nations. And it set up a Unite Aware system, which is now being mainstreamed based on, I heard Dave mention Ushahidi. It's got an Ushahidi database behind it, but it's got an Esri front end. It went to cloud computing, so in many ways it has an advantage over a lot of militaries in the sense that the information is not so dispersed on hard drives all over. When you went with Microsoft for Office 365, and then a lot of it is done through this private cloud in Brindisi, which is a picture you see there with columns of the field. But there are some cases where the nations that actually have UAVs, for instance, Germany in Mali, will actually send in real time the imagery back to their host state, their home country, and then analyze imagery and send an analyzed report back to the UN. So now I'm getting to the answering your question, which is a little future looking. And I think Dave gave us a wonderful backward looking or looking into the, how things got to where they are. And I think we can spend a lot of this session looking at how things can be in the future, what we can add. When I first did this diagram, I was working at Sandia National Labs at the Cooperative Monitoring Center, and the UN hadn't deployed even half of the technologies on here. Now they're toying around with more than half of them, with the aerostats and the UAVs coming there, and some ground surveillance radars. But there's really a need for much more sensors on the ground. One of the proposals that I'm looking at exploring with the UN is using laser signaling. So if you have to tell someone to stop, the UN doesn't like to use bullets if there's atrocities being committed, but it could do this by telling someone that you're being monitored. So send a signal by a laser, shining a red dot on someone's chest might stop them. I'm also looking at the training simulations. So how do you train peacekeepers? So some of the video technology that we see now could be applied into UN missions, and taking the commercial Unity software, we can find all kinds of ways. Another key concept, and I think this ties very well in with what Dave was talking about, the networking, the synergies, is that you can have one of your greatest partners is the local population. You can connect with them. In fact, the UN's power to protect depends on its power to connect. And when you're mandated to protect civilians, it's essential to connect with them. So I call this participatory peacekeeping. With the cell phone revolution, we have all kinds of new forms of information input, and I call it protection through connection and creating the coalition of the connected. So that the international mission is only at the top of the pyramid, but further on down, we have at the bottom is really the population that provides the most important and the largest amount of information, the technology, the sensors on top of that, locally hired observers, and then it's all tied in through some sort of fusion unit. And then I'll leave you with a couple other concepts of cyber peacekeeping. Can we do in cyberspace what we already do in physical space? Can we have UN cyber blue helmets that are going in and creating layers between opposing parties? Can you do some basic reporting on the types of attacks? Can you help nations and people be resilient to cyber attacks? So there's a whole area to explore there. Tomorrow I'm with the Department of Political Affairs and Peace Building, look at AI for mediation. So we're really trying to do that here at the UN. And then of course, telemedicine in an age of COVID. I'm going to leave that 15-minute and in 6-minute presentation with you, but I'm happy to explore further. Thanks for the opportunity.
Very thoughtful and very innovative, start. Dr. Dorn, thanks for that. I will leave the opportunity for the other panelists to answer this question, and then we will have a little bit more Q&A because you brought in something very exciting for the new state of the RDI and advancing them, and some things that we research community have been looking into. So that'll be great. So with that, JC, would you please?
Yeah. So I think that one of the biggest differences, and this will definitely get to this in my demo, between what we're doing now in our concept of operations for disaster response and for some of these kinds of missions, and maybe 20 years ago, right, when all of this started, and now, is that level of adversarial cyber that's going on. So you used to be able to, land, you have good people, you're doing good stuff. The networks are pretty open, they're permissive, you're, accessing people and devices and software, and it's great because you're not necessarily under continuous adversarial attack and attempts to exfiltrate your data and compromise the reliability of the services you're providing. And we now live in a less innocent time, right? We've seen relief operations targeted kinetically, and they are now being targeted in the cyber domain. And so this is an extra element to consider, and it requires a greater level of vigilance and supply chain assurance and all the rest of it. That's not necessarily fun, but that diligence has to be done because we don't want people in places who are doing good things for the right reasons to get owned. And that is happening now. And that's different. And so I think we all have to figure out what it means to take this into account.
Yeah, a very important issue, Jesse. I think, of course, when we play in the exhibition, the video that you have provided, yeah, it actually brings those points, definitely. So, okay, with that, Dr. Warner, do you want to share any thoughts? And you already shared earlier, but on this line of like your in your wish list, that one ICT tech that you want to see coming forward to address this issue.
The psychic chip. I mean, it really going towards the AI, ML kinds of things, because as JC brought up, it is a very different environment cyber-wise than when we first started hitting the ground doing it. And we've adapted to time. And when I say the psychic chip, it turns out that a lot of things can be made, can make the humans aware of their environment so they can make a judgment on how much risk to take. I'm very against technologies that red, green, blues, go, no go. Look, in combat, totally understand that. But we lose when the people on the ground with the information, one, are not informed, and two, if they are informed, they can't counter. And so I would think that more, soaking up all the information, all the Twitter feeds, we're doing this in other projects, and I can tell you it's substantially benefiting us in increasing our intelligence. When I first started doing this, if you use the word humanitarian intelligence, you could get escorted from whatever building you're in, UN otherwise. And intelligence was a bad word. Well, intelligence is good. You should have lots of it. The more intelligence you have, the better it is. And good AI, ML to address the things, as JC was saying, And also to what Walter was saying about all the new different devices. Well, I'm a human, I'm making decisions. I only got so much time. Feed my brain. Let me make good decisions, make smart people smarter.
Excellent. So with this now, the second question comes towards the resilience and security of this communication technologies and how do we approach it. To an extent, we have talked about there's a state of the art technologies for communication that we leverage, where we have Dr. Dorn initially showed a very nice pyramid actually, where you have people on the ground in the loop as well, with the help of these platforms which allow anonymized information sharing as well, like we see on social media. So with that, there is a narrative that gets built up, and narrative that gets actually controlled as well by adversaries, clearly. So any thoughts on, while we recognize this is a problem, this is, I can tell you, computationally researching on these kinds of spaces, it is very challenging. Like basically, in the way when information is not like factual, but it is subjective, it's incomplete, and that gets shared. That's actually very damaging. And sometimes people just keep sharing because of the certain prior beliefs they might have, or because the part of the information that they are able to associate with, and so on and so forth. But adversaries certainly can exploit that in different disaster settings. We know for sure. We have seen that increasingly happening. So with that kind of setup of new forms of information communication technologies and platforms, what are your thoughts on what basically researchers should think about, or any strategies that as a lessons we can learn from the prior times of these ICTs from before? So any thoughts basically starting from any of the panelists, please?
One point I'd like to make is that it's very important to help the local ICT framework so that people can communicate. Give them the tools that people can actually help themselves and help rescue themselves. And I just take a few examples, or at least I'll just use one. In the Congo, the United Nations helped build some cell towers so that locals could communicate with themselves better. But the UN was already very highly dependent on its own phone communications using the phones of the peacekeepers. And so when the UN networks, which were more secure, but which had their problems, when they were facing limitations, then using the local networks was a backup. It was redundancy. And so part of creating resilience is to provide greater comms for the locals. Now, you do have the problem that it can also mean that bad actors can also benefit from that. So some really good intelligence, we use the word peacekeeping intelligence, since Dave mentioned that intelligence is no longer the dirty word. If you know that certain actors are using certain cell phone towers or communication means, you could still work to be able to shut those down. But by and large, it should be creating a ICT infrastructure for as wide a base as possible, which in the end strengthens your own base.
And there's also, just to build on that a bit, there's an aspect of infrastructure which well-capitalized enterprises typically don't take into account when they're doing procurement, which is maintainability, right? So when things are bought, they generally get bought for performance, for capability, right? And there's a cutting edgeness that people want new features and functionality, but they're not necessarily highly maintainable. You might need a defense contractor to go ahead and maintain that for you. If you're going into an austere environment, it becomes very, very important that these systems be open and maintainable, because in addition to reliability going down when things aren't maintainable, security is also sacrificed when they're not maintainable, because they become out of date and vulnerable. And so for all kinds of reasons, you may want to default to solutions that are perhaps just a little bit less performant, less sexy, but more maintainable, as if the locals are going to be maintaining them, because that might make you more resilient. And so it sounds really boring, but maintenance is a thing. And it's really, really important to take this into account as a kind of first order consideration when you're thinking about deployment.
Excellent point, Jesse. And this actually speaks to the policies and I think our agencies, funding agencies as well, who do, come up with the plans and protocols for this procurement. I agree with you. Very interesting point. Dave, do you want to share?
Yeah, just real quickly, I want to echo and amplify what JC just pointed out and give you an example. In Eastern Afghanistan, where I've spent a bit of time, we had a project called Operation Cyberpass. And the idea was to put solar powered internet labs in remote areas and give the locals that are really in the rough areas the ability to communicate and to participate. And there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of spooky reasons to do it. There's all kinds of puppies and rainbows, happiness and goodness reasons to do it. And we had an experience where some DoD contractors, good folks, came in with their good technology and it broke. And so the solar panels that were placed at people risking their life to take up other places could not be maintained. And that site was very much at risk of being lost. And one thing we learned in Afghanistan, and we really learned this hard, use the local economy. So basically, I would buy solar panels out on the market. I would hire a local engineer to do it. And with whatever was available, with no special, first world tech for the rural areas. And I'll tell you what, I have solar labs now that have been, they're going 5 years plus in the border areas in Eastern Afghanistan. And with these systems, because they can be purchased locally, they can be maintained locally, and the communications itself became something to empower the villages for their own security. By the way, when they can talk, they can also share like, hey, bad guys are going to come kill you. You probably want to buckle down. That really is important. So if you see this as humans as a distributed sensor network for good, it is incredibly important from a resilience perspective of having something that can work when you're gone.
Yeah. Rare and expensive people or parts are something to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Very interesting insights. So our panelists are very efficient. 2 questions and covered a lot of insights for those 2 questions. Third question that I have, and with that, we'll just take 5 additional minutes and end the panel, just in the interest of time. And the third question is about this point that I think you also touched upon earlier about open source technologies, right? And the use of them, because clearly there is a benefit to them. But open source technologies also come with a price because there are a lot of vulnerabilities that gets associated with them. And part of them can be, related to this idea of like, this locals, empowering them, and it can relate to that as well, because with the help of a community which maintains can actually help maintain the open source technologies. So any thoughts towards the future of open source technologies for resilience and support for our HADR community?
The first thing is that open source has won, right? So even proprietary technologies are 70 to 80% open source technologies, right? And the only difference is the procurement model and your level of transparency. And so what you should have is a level of transparency on what you're using, right? So even if it's a proprietary thing, you should know what's in it. You should ask people for a software bill of materials. And the FDA is already requiring this for medical devices, right? Because you don't want to be hacked through your infusion pump for chemotherapy. But open source, one of the advantages to it is this level of transparency. And so you can actually start to differentiate between, a very well-supported project to which your local people can contribute as developers or even as bug fixers or bug identifiers, and things that are essentially sort of zombie capabilities that was someone's master's thesis 9 years ago and no one cares about it and it's not being maintained. And so the ability to instrument the ecosystem is a lot of what I've been working on in the last 5 years, so that people can make informed decisions like Dave about how much risk do you want to take, right? You may want to use that master's thesis code project that hasn't been maintained, but you should probably, you know, put your eyes on it and maybe, you know, give it a little bit of diva scrub before you do that. So open source is great because you have transparency, but it's also, you also have to make some decisions. It's supply chain management, just like anything, just like your reliable tires or, you know, your communication devices, you know, where's that stuff coming from? And is there a risk that you could get bottlenecked, right, in the supply chain because of some supplier issue or ecosystem risk or product defect that will leave you hanging?
Sorry, so just I wanted to, because of your experience and expertise on that, is what do you see the role when actually these open source technologies are for the new forms of ICTs, such as this artificial intelligence systems? Because you can game the systems. Being working in that space, I can actually tell you that, right? It's all data driven. So you can game the system with a lot of like this that you see with the deep fakes, you know, a lot of, you know, that in the news that comes in, but it is because of these challenges that we have, you know, with these technologies. So any thoughts towards that?
Well, the interesting thing about AI/ML is that it is largely dependent on a huge open source ecosystem. Most of the underlying components in these systems are open source, right? So that's a really important thing to know. The other thing is just this concept of chain of custody, right? So we tend to think about data like it's digital, you can copy it, it doesn't matter where you got it. And that's the way we've always thought of ICT, but chain of custody really matters. Like, where specifically did this come from? Can you identify the URL and all the steps that were taken for the source data, how it was transformed, and you know, its path to you? And this provenance and chain of custody is really important because there was a wonderful Atlantic Council report called Breaking Trust on cyber that identified all the different places where attacks can happen. And it's very important to actually know, kind of like the tag on the cow's ear, you know, what farm did this come from? Because if you don't have that, you're really flying blind on a kind of a big data level. Because if your data is compromised, then your decisions are going to be compromised. So it's very important to know, you know, where that lettuce came from, so to speak.
We'll let Dr. Dorn also give some thoughts for this third question.
Sure, very quickly, I just echo what's being said and maybe build on it. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, we guys.
I think that the open source is the preferred method, but there are many times when you want some proprietary software that gives you special features. And the way to work is, the best way is to be able to look at them as not as competing with each other, but actually as synergistic. So you can have hybrid solutions. I highlighted Unite Aware, which is the new situation awareness program that the UN is developing. And so it's based on the Shahidi database for open source. But then it has the Esri front end on it that gives you much better graphical interface and allows you to tie in lots of things, like they do real-time tracking of vehicles and radios. And sometimes open source can be rather rudimentary, and you need the kind of finessing that would come in. And so the third option is the hybrid, is build on open source, but customize your solution. And that can be done in an open source fashion, or it can be done in a proprietary fashion. But the hybrid is really beneficial.
I would just jump to that though, because when we talk about data, one of the things you see a lot in proprietary solutions that build on open source is the attempt to roach motel the data, right? So users can put it in, but they can't get it back out. So then you're a hostage to that platform. And so I think it's very incumbent on end users to figure out how much lock-in there is associated with proprietary solutions, and to make sure that they have open interfaces, both for import and for export of the underlying data, because that is your data.
Yeah, so I agree. Just be smart about it.
I want to just put in I work at the very front edge when I go to places. So you have to be creative, and we can't always have a surety. We can't have a surety of our software. We can't have a surety of anything. And I was joking with someone the other day. They're like, "Well, how are you still alive?" You know, and it turns out we use, basically, you've heard of blockchain. Well, we do the human version of that, brain chain. If I can have 5 or 6 power nerds around the country that have their network certifying it, that brain chain actually allows me to make a better risk decision. Because in any time there's a fusion between proprietary and non-proprietary things, you lose something. Sometimes you gain things, but you always lose something, and you don't know what that is. And it's, not all. So having the humans, a constant active network, always percolating of what's going on, has been probably one of the best benefits, to be alerted to these kinds of things of, hey, try this for that, don't try this, etc. Oh, we found a bug in that. So having a background community, the background radiation of a community, is probably singularly more important than any specific solution at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Warner. So, panelists, I want to thank all of you for time and sharing this vast knowledge and experience you have. Given in interest of time, I have to move forward. I just want to take 3-4 minutes from you, if that's okay, to just let our audience also, if they have a question. I know one person has. Nick, you want to go ahead and ask that question, please?
Yes, sir. Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to say that some valid points were made, and in every challenge, there's an opportunity to do things better and more secure. I think that the biggest threat is that our adversary is going to be not only attacking the data, but I would think they're attacking more so those cell towers, the means of communication, and not get that far down, at least in disaster relief, to the actual data. But I could be very wrong in that. The Army has developed a program, mentioned sustainment and maintenance, and I agree with what you're saying. The Army developed a program, and it's called Buy, Try, Decide. So they actually put the equipment, they buy the equipment, they test it, and if it doesn't do what they expect for it to do, if it can't be maintained and sustained and trained and all the other things, they don't, it doesn't become a program. And so I just wanted to share that. But it's fascinating, because earlier the student talked about texting and messaging, and something that everyone got used to. Like being out at George Mason University, everyone is becoming a communicator. And like Dave said earlier, the more we put in folks' hands, the better equipped they are. The more knowledge that we put in their hands, the more equipped they are to react to different tragedies, to different, just all to lack of communication. Because, like, for instance, say you're in George Mason University and you choose a network. I'm just going to keep it simple. You choose a network and you're using the Wi-Fi in that network. Well, what happens when that Wi-Fi goes down? If you don't know to go to your settings, change it, to another Wi-Fi that's available, then you're kind of stuck. And so that's what I'm talking about. And Dave did a great job. I don't think it's up to you if you want me to do the video, if you just want me to brief off the slides. I can do it either way, but I'm sorry for taking probably the whole 4 minutes. So I'll just stop.
So with that, I think given the time, I know all of you have to go. So we have like 2 exhibition demos basically to go with. So with that, I'll basically let you guys have any questions you can share with us. We'll share with the panelists or engage directly with the panelists. Let's thank our panelists. We can just do virtual claps for our panelists and for our invited talk speaker today. It was fantastic learning experience, and this is so short time, I must say that, to given the kind of knowledge that you have and learn from you. So thanks again, Dr. Dorn, Dr. Warner, and Ms. Hers as well. It's fantastic to have you guys, and look forward to engage with you next in the future as well, in future StarTides event. All right, so with that, we're gonna move to the next part of the ICT track session. That's going to be about two fantastic technology demos, one from Iron Channel and another from Getter Cubic.
Good afternoon. Welcome to STARTIDES 2020. Covering the convergent approaches to sustainable resilience. I'm Nick Parisian. I'm a member of Gator Technology. I'm the Army Account Manager. Gator Technology has a heritage in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We started doing disaster relief response back in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. I was actually a soldier during that time. We were unable to get our wheeled vehicles to remote locations that were cut off. It was just a catastrophe. Property owner of Gator Technologies came and explained what he could do with inflatable satellite antenna. We got him on small bird up to his remote site. He was able to get internet accountability, start to order things, notifying families, and so he was a huge success. In 2007, we were in U.S. Comfort, South America. In 2008, we did AIDS. We did an aid relief mission for South Africa. In 2010, we responded to a typhoon in the Philippines, to an earthquake in Nepal in 2014, hurricane relief for Maria and Irma in Puerto Rico in 2017. Some of our business partners is Cisco, SES, FEMA, and Emergency Telecommunications clusters, excuse me. And so what's the big deal? Well, I hope you got my handout, and I miss being there at George Mason University this year. I miss the staff, also miss Lynn and his staff. The big deal is the size, weight, and power that our systems are at. Now, we have the most transportable systems in the world. Some of the pictures here shown from Hurricane Michael, Florida, 2018, depicts 4 systems in the back of an SUV. When we responded to Mozambique in 2019 for the cyclone, you see it illustrated there, 2.4 meter antennas. We responded to Hurricane Dorn in the Bahamas in 2019. And in this picture, you'll see the small bird that we're using to transport our systems. On the far right, you'll see a flex antenna, which is actually made out of material that could fit in a lunchbox. In 2019, actually the beginning of 20, we competed for the COVID-19 Army Ventilator Challenge. We used components of our inflatable satellite system. We worked hand in hand with Alabama University, College of Nursing to use their Learning Technology Resource Center. We used their human patient simulator iStan to test and prototype a ventilator device called Ventigator. We submitted a white paper to the Army and we were selected for phase 1. For phase 2, which was the final phase, we were not selected as a material solution for the Ventigator, so we didn't go to full rate production. In the chart, you'll see the pictures of the Ventigator. We participated in Hurricane Laura, Lake Charles in Louisiana, 2020. And you see the pictures there. We started our business participating in hurricane relief and disaster, and we're going to end it that way. And what I mean by that is we'll continue to do it as long as we're in business. And so that's a short synopsis of what Gator Technologies is all about. I hope you're able to get your hands on my handout, and I also hope that you'll try to contact me should you have any questions. Thank you.
demo, and starting here.
My name is JC Hertz, and I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity for disaster response. Disaster responders use a lot of open source software for a lot of great reasons. It's adaptable. You can develop new features and functionality in the field. You can collaborate with other people, and it's inexpensive. Typically, when there's been a disaster, you don't have a lot of cash for software licenses, so that's great. The issue is that disaster response networks tend to be very porous. It's easy to get strangers onto the network and access, and you've got to be able to do that. And they tend to be very promiscuous. It's easy to get software of unknown provenance onto the network and onto devices. So people need to do stuff, and they're putting software on devices and networks to access data so they can do stuff in a disaster. And that's sort of the nature of the game. The problem is that these capabilities are not all necessarily secure. And it used to be, we talked about open source versus proprietary, and open source was great and collaborative and community-based, and proprietary software was, just some expensive vendor solution. But open source is in everything now. And we've got to start making some distinctions between open source that's responsibly maintained and stuff that's just lying around that doesn't get maintained. So I like to say that a certified diamond and crazy jewels, which you buy out of a vending machine at a supermarket, are both jewelry, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should be put in the same category. So we live in a less innocent world. There are adversarial actors that are targeting disaster response and the provisionally restored infrastructure that is typically put in place after a disaster, because it is inherently less secure. You don't have layered network defenses and intrusion detection and identity and access management. And you don't have a lot of physical access control because that's the nature of the mission. And people are out there operating for financial gain. They're operating for all kinds of reasons. They may be geopolitical reasons. And if you're compromised, you're not going to have a lot of technical or financial resources to remediate that damage. You're going to lose your data. You may also be compromised with regard to availability, which makes the disaster even worse. So the open source software supply chain for disaster response needs a deeper look and a harder scrub. Case study, Open Hospital, developed by a nonprofit in Italy. Their website has a bunch of beautiful children from Africa. This is a capability that has supposedly been used in 13 countries with 23 installations and has processed birth records, vaccination records, lab results for 425,000 people. This is a successful open source project. However, when Ion Channel started analyzing it in April of 2020, we found 3 Trojans in it. And these viruses were present for 6 solid months before they finally fixed it. We informed them there were viruses. It took them 6 months to get around to fixing that, during which time those 23 operational installations in 13 countries were exposed to these viruses. And I doubt they have a lot in the way of cyber resources to respond to and remediate any compromise that may have occurred. If you scan this capability today, you will not find a virus. You will also not find that it was infected for 6 months and that it wasn't maintained. And its level of maintenance, some might call negligent. So what Ion Channel does free of charge for public health and disaster response communities is to monitor these kinds of capabilities daily. They may be projects you want to use or libraries you want to incorporate into your own software development. As a responder, you can make an eyes open decision about what you want to use based on its risks. And you can see which teams developing capabilities are responsible and responsive, and which ones have just abandoned their capabilities and are just going to get owned in an adversarial environment. If you're a software development team, if you fix things and update things and keep them secure, you'll be able to differentiate yourself against other capabilities that may look fantastic but are vulnerable. So all that good, responsible work you do will be visible. Our governance criteria is no virus, no higher critical vulnerabilities, and we keep the maintenance records of how many days passing, how many days failing, and time to remediation, which is a proxy for every other relevant cyber metric. And this is the kind of thing you want to see, right? So this is a CDC team. They maintain a gene sequencing application used in COVID, and we informed them of some findings in May. They remediated them. They were green for months. A new vulnerability pops up because it does. And they were green within 6 weeks. Within 2 weeks. And they keep their stuff up to date. And this is a kind of record you want to see in an open source capability that you use in disaster response. So if you want, as the STARTIDES community, to have the open source capabilities that you use monitored and analyzed for security issues, email support@ionchannel.io. We'll give you an account and we will throw whatever those capabilities are into monitoring, and you will have full access to the data and the ability to add other projects. Thank you very much.
All right. So that was a very great, very interesting, great demo, Jessie. Thank you for that. Very insightful, I must say that. So thanks both Jessie and Nick. If there are any questions, we have 3 more minutes for the session. So I'll just open the Q&A floor if anybody wants to ask question to Jessie or Nick. All right, if not a question right away, you can reach out to them. Their contact information is also available in the STARTIDES program. And as you know, again, with the folks who presented here, if you want to reach out to them, Jessie Hertz and Nick Parisi, both you can connect with them as well. I want to thank all of you. It was a great session, very I would say insightful and a lot of interesting discussions. So thanks to our invited speaker, our panelists, and all the audience who joined this session. This was a great session for learning, and I hope you have a lot of lessons to take from this session. So thank you very much all for joining this session.